Nice to be in a warm place.
Amen.
What is life worth? Now, I asked that for a reason, and don't misunderstand me. I am thankful to be an American, and I'm so appreciative of the way that God has blessed our country down through the years. But I asked that question for a reason, because for the last year, one of the major TV networks has been doing their Buy American campaign, and I mentioned to you the other Wednesday night about our country this past year giving China 17 point some odd $1 million for social programs, and we borrowed the money from China to be able to give it to them for their programs. And we know that so much of what comes from China is the only thing quite often that we have accessibility to buy and purchase. What's a life worth? Here's the reason why I asked that. How many of you remember a couple of years ago on Wednesday night when I did the message on Dolittle's Raiders on Above and Beyond the Call of Duty? Well, here's something that I probably left out that you don't know, most people don't know. That for the Dolittle Raiders that did escape and did get to come home, it was the Chinese that helped them to escape. And because of that, the Japanese killed over 250,000 Chinese for helping our airmen. That's a lot of people. And when I say they killed them, they brutally. There has really not been a group of people, as you study history, that have been any more brutal than what Japan, the Japanese people, have been in the past. I mean, when you go back and study, look, if you've never studied about the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, you ought to go back and study about that. And it wasn't just there, but some of the most brutal people that there ever have been in the world when it comes to the atrocities done on their enemies. It's been the Japanese, some of the most brutal people that there ever has been. But because of China's help to our airmen, getting them, securing their freedom and keeping them from the Japanese military and getting them out of the country. What y'all don't realize too, most of y'all don't realize, because you don't study history, is that long before we entered war with Japan, Japan was already conquering China. And the Pacific Theater, before Pearl Harbor, Japan was just brutalizing the whole Pacific Theater, and had already occupied much of mainland China. And the reason for that is because they have very few natural resources themselves. So in order to have the empire that they desired, they had to have the natural resources of other countries. And to do that, they had to take them. But think about it now, over 250,000 Chinese brutally killed for a group's help in getting some American airmen away from the Japanese military and getting them back home. So what's a life worth? Think about that. Amen? History's a wonderful thing, really. And how many of you remember when I dealt with that? I told you about the bombardier on Airplane 16. Y'all remember? Jacob DeShazer. His dad was a preacher. He was lost. God makes no mistakes. He was on the 16th airplane, which was the very last one. And excuse my English, but the name of that particular B-25 Mitchell was the Bat Out of Hell. That's what it was named. And if y'all remember the story, I told you how that plane went down and they were captured. And while in Japanese prison, Jacob DeShazer got saved. But it wasn't merely from his past experience through his dad, but it was through someone else that he didn't meet until he got on board the USS Hornet. And when he got on board the USS Hornet, the man that he met that would become so instrumental in his life was the pilot of the Bat Out of Hell, a man by the name of Bill Farrell. If you ever see the pictures of those fellas, as you look, Bill Farrell is 6'4" tall. He was too tall to be a pilot in the military, but they inducted him anyway. And those group of men never met until they were already out to sea. Even though they trained, and they trained vigorously, out of all the men that trained and volunteered for that mission, before they went on that mission, then the best were picked, hand-picked, and put on board the USS Hornet. And then when they got out to sea, then they were all put together in their 5-man crews. And so it was out to sea that Jacob DeShazer met Bill Farrell. Bill Farrell was a member of the First Baptist Church in Darlington and been a faithful saint of God. Think about that for just a minute. God makes no mistakes. Jacob DeShazer came home. Bill Farrell was, he was put to death while in Japan after years of brutal torture. He was executed. But he was instrumental in the life of Jacob DeShazer. He got saved while in prison camp. He came home. God called him to preach. God called him to the mission field. Jacob went back to Japan as a missionary. One of Jacob's first converts, how many of y'all remember who I told you it was? One of Jacob's first converts was the lead pilot of Pearl Harbor. He made it through the war. The lead pilot. God called him to preach, but God called him into another ministry too. He was a great artist, and so like Jack Chick started here in the United States, that Japanese ex-soldier, now won to God by Jacob DeShazer, one of the Raiders. He does comic book tracks for kids and teenagers in Japan to see those kids won to the Lord instead of following the Emperor of Japan. I could go on and on tonight, but man, it's all that's amazing. That's why you ought to study about history. One of the greatest patriots was Bill Farrell. He loved his country, loved his church. His favorite aunt had been a missionary for years and years until she finally came home, and he wrote back and forth. She helped put him in school, and just to see the way that God works. And you have to wonder what would have happened with Jacob DeShazer's life if he'd never met Bill Farrell. And if he hadn't been the light to him in that Japanese prison that he was, would he have got saved? Maybe not. Certainly wouldn't have been called to preach if he hadn't got saved. He would not have been a missionary going back to Japan. Amazing what God does.
Amen.
Amen. And I know life is boring to some folks, but it's not boring to me, and history is not boring to me either. So anyway, take